And welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you after a 2-week hiatus to today's webinar as part of our spring semester series, The Power of Emotion, Judaism, and the Inner Life. Special welcome to any first-time attendees today. So before I go any further, about today's program, I just want to kind of state the obvious, which is that things have changed a lot in the world since we met 2 weeks ago. So I just wanted to acknowledge that a different kind of array of anxieties and emotions, speaking of the power of emotion, might be part of what we're experiencing right now. I know I'm thinking even more than I would be otherwise about the situation in Ukraine, because we actually have a senior rabbinical student who I'm teaching who was planning to head back to Ukraine at the end of this year to work with the Masorti movement there. It's a very fearful, difficult time for her. So on the subject of Ukraine, we're actually putting together kind of a rapid response webinar, which has been very generously offered by Professor David Fishman, our professor of modern history, who many of you have learned with before in our Monday webinars. And we're finalizing the time, but that's going to be this Wednesday in the one o'clock hour, give or take. So you'll definitely be getting an email from us about that. But he really has a wealth of modern history to share with us about the Ukraine and about the Jewish community there, and about the implications of what's going on. So it should be really, really informative and helpful. And I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. I also want to invite you to another program that we're having on Thursday, our annual Rappaport lecture, which it's a very interesting topic this year, and I'm just going to take a minute to tell you about it. There was a documentary series screened on Israeli TV about American Judaism and kind of all the varieties of Jewish expression here in America. And this took Israel by storm. It was an incredibly popular series. And we've put together a really wonderful panel on Thursday to kind of talk about how and whether American Judaism and kind of Jewish creativity here impacts Jewish life and identity in Israel, and ways in which it doesn't, sort of progressive developments and innovations there that are different from what's happening here. So we have one of the filmmakers and Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum, who's a very creative Masorti rabbi. We have a wonderful panel. I'm going to actually put the link in the chat so you can check it out, and I hope that you'll join us on Thursday. All right, and also on Wednesday for the Ukraine program. So lots going on this week with JTS. So let me now turn to today's program. So we're so pleased to have Professor Sarah Wolfe teaching us today. And I don't know if you know this, Professor Wolfe, but your work was part of the inspiration of our spring series. So some of you may have noticed that Professor Wolfe appears twice in our lineup for this series, kind of unprecedented for us, but she has been doing all kinds of great work on emotion in Jewish texts. So we're really thrilled that you're here with us today. And Tani will introduce you a bit more length in a few minutes. Sorry. For your session on jealousy and gender in rabbinic literature. We also, of course, want to thank our really generous sponsors for today. We have an anonymous sponsor at the Navi level, that's the $1,800 level. So thank you so very much to that generous donor for helping to make this session possible. And we also have Dr. Amy Werman, who is sponsored at the Chacham level in loving memory of her mom, Rabbi Marilyn Werman, Zichron Livracha, JTS class of 1993, and our earliest vanguard of women rabbis. So thank you so much, Dr. Woman, for sponsoring in your mom's memory. We invite anyone to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a learning session with our outstanding faculty. We have 3 sponsorship levels. Chacham is 540, Tzaddik is 1,000, Navi is 1,800. You can learn more by contacting learninglives@jtsa.edu. And thank you once again. And I'll turn it over to Tani now for some additional announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to give a brief review about how we'll do our Q&A for today's session, Dr. Wolfe will pause for questions periodically throughout the session. And again, at the end, please chat any questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. She will moderate the questions and present them to Dr. Wolfe. For any technical or logistical questions, you can initiate a private chat with either myself or with Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link this morning, and we'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Wolfe, Assistant Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. As Rabbi Andelman mentioned, Dr. Wolfe is doing a great deal of work around emotion. Her current book project examines the construction of emotions as legal categories in rabbinic literature. Dr. Wolfe is also a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. I'm so pleased now to turn it over to Dr. Wolfe.
All right, thank you so much, Tani and Rabbi Andelman, and our sponsors for today, and to all of you for taking time out of your day to learn with me. Okay, so the title of today's class is Gender and Jealousy in Rabbinic Literature. And we're going to be exploring the connections that are made in rabbinic texts. So that means focusing on literature from approximately the first 6 or so centuries of the Common Era, connections that are made in those texts between emotions and gender. But before, I want to just take a minute to frame what I mean when I talk about a connection between emotions and gender. So I imagine that all of you have either heard, or if you haven't heard this explicitly, at least sort of take to be true, at least one of the following statements. Men tend to have more problems with uncontrolled anger than women do. Women tend to be more insecure than men, especially in workplace environments. Women tend to be more empathetic than men. Men are more naturally assertive than women. So this is not a list of statements that I'm about to debunk for you as false. I'm also not endorsing any of these statements as true across the board. Just that in general, many people—
Dr. Wolfe, I see them. Oh, great. Okay. All right. Okay, so just to recap, I had mentioned a few statements that were ways in which I think people in our culture, let's say in North America, tend to think about the relationship between gender and emotions, right? Things like women are more empathic or men are more naturally assertive. Right, to some extent, these kinds of statements, we would say, are stereotypes, right? They're generalizations about a group of people. They're assumptions that people tend to make, right? And they, of course, are not true to a person, right? They can sort of overgeneralize. But
it's a little more complicated than that, because they're not just kind of false stereotypes for a number of reasons, one of which is, you know, hormones and biology are real and do to some extent, right, play a role, right? This is not something that always gets talked about, but I had one of my students who is transgender talked about her experience going on estrogen, and all of a sudden she started crying a lot more, right? These things are real, they have a real biological effect. And social norms are real, right? Even if stereotypes are to some extent based in generalizations, they also affect the way that we understand our feelings and the way we live our lives, right? So if I'm taught from a young age that as a girl, it's okay for me to cry, but really bad if I yell or hit someone, right? Then I'm going to be socialized to be much more in touch with my tears, let's say, than I am with my anger, right? So it starts from a place of sort of a generalization or a stereotype, right? But it can really actually wind up manifesting in a kind of reality, right? In terms of the way that I'm taught to experience myself, or that I'm taught to present myself to the world. And the fact that socialization, right, plays such a big role means that ideas about the connection between gender and emotion, just like all kinds of ideas about gender, are going to be different in different times and places, right? Depending on what idea that society has about gender, right? That's actually going to make a real difference in terms of the way people in that society are socialized to think about and express their own emotions. So that is all a little bit of backdrop, just to say that what we're going to be doing today is exploring the connection in particular between jealousy and gender in rabbinic literature. So we're going to ask, what are the gendered associations that the ancient rabbis had with emotion, and in particular with jealousy? Is it viewed as positive? Is it viewed as negative? What gender is it associated with, and why and how? And then at the end, we're going to ask how looking at the way the rabbis think about these connections can help us shed light on gendered ideas of emotion today. So we're going to be focusing on jealousy in a particular context. It may be somewhat surprising to know that in rabbinic literature, jealousy actually gets the most attention, not in a storytelling context, but in a legal context. And we're going to start off, I'm going to share my sources in just a second. We're going to start off with an introduction to what this legal context is, in which jealousy plays such a big role. And that is going to mean going back to the biblical text. So let me share these sources. Nope, that did not work. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, not my computer. Trying to make sure that this is okay. Yes, good. Okay, sources are up. Yes, everyone can see the sources. Okay, excellent. Okay, so we are going to turn now to a passage from the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, that talks about a particular ritual. It's known in rabbinic literature as the Sota Ritual. So this may be familiar to some of you. For some of you, this may be totally new. I just want to make a note before we dive into these sources, that this ritual, which has to do with a woman who's been accused of her husband by adultery, is one of the, I would say, more disturbing texts from Jewish tradition, especially from a gendered lens. So I just want to name that, acknowledge that there may be some material here that is a little bit sort of disturbing or upsetting, especially when it comes to the biblical material, but we're going to really dive into it and we're going to see how it actually gets transformed in rabbinic literature, actually in some ways that I think we'll find very, very potentially useful. Okay, so the biblical text, I'm going to read some of it word for word, and some of it I'm going to sort of paraphrase because this is a long passage. But the biblical text begins by framing the following scenario. If a man's wife has gone astray and broken faith with him, in that a man has had carnal relations with her, unbeknown to her husband, and she keeps secret the fact that she has defiled herself without being forced, and there is no witness against her. Okay, so essentially, right, there's a married couple, it's a man and a woman, the woman has cheated on her husband with somebody, and there's no witnesses, okay? But a fit of jealousy comes over him. We're talking about the husband now. And he is wrought up about the wife who has defiled herself. Okay, so let's take that as scenario one, right? So this is our first introduction to the type of thing that could set this ritual that we're about to describe into motion. Scenario two, I'm after the semicolon now here in the bolded part. Or if a fit of jealousy comes over one and he is wrought up about his wife, although she has not defiled herself. Okay, option number two is this husband is actually jealous for no good reason. Nothing has happened. His wife has not cheated on him, right? Either way, the text makes it very clear that the one thing that is going on with this husband is that he is feeling jealous. Okay, maybe his wife has cheated on him, maybe she has not. Either way, he is feeling jealous. And then the text dives right into a description of all of the stuff that happens next as a result of this husband's jealousy. And we're not going to go into close detail here about what happens in this ritual, but basically it's a kind of ordeal. It's a kind of sort of magical trial almost, in which the man brings the wife before the Kohen, the priest, and she has to basically drink a special potion. The Kohen, the priest, also offers up a special meal offering, which, as you can see in the bold, is again referred to as an offering of jealousy. I'll just note that in the Hebrew, in the biblical Hebrew, so the word for jealousy is kin'ah. The meal offering of jealousy is referred to as a minchat kena'ot. So if I were to translate that totally literally, it would be actually not a meal offering of jealousy, but a meal offering of jealousies, like plural jealousy. Just we'll flag that. We're going to come back to that later because it's going to be picked up on in the rabbinic text. But certainly, right, the name of this special offering that the Kohen is offering is a offering of jealousy. Okay, and then the woman is going to drink basically this special potion, and the Kohen basically sort of says this special oath for the woman, saying, you know, if you haven't done anything wrong, nothing bad is going to happen to you, and if you have cheated on your husband, God is going to cause your thigh to sag and your belly to distend. The woman says, amen, amen. She drinks the special potion. And this is, kind of the same logic by which, things like witch trials are supposed to work, right? That you sort of, you have this kind of magical ritual that happens to this woman. If she's guilty, right, then there's a certain kind of physical outcome. If she's innocent, there's another kind of physical outcome. That's exactly what happens here, right? If she's innocent, nothing happens to her. If she's guilty, she has this sort of thigh sag, belly distend thing. One of the theories of what's going on there is that that's actually sort of a biblical euphemism for her having been potentially pregnant, and then she has a miscarriage. Okay, so this is sort of one possible way to read what the outcome of this ordeal is supposed to be. And at the end of our biblical description of this ritual, we have a repetition of essentially the language that was used to introduce it, which again emphasizes the importance of the husband's jealousy, right? And I'm back in the bold here at the end. This is the ritual in cases of jealousy, when a woman goes astray while married to her husband and defiles herself, or when a fit of jealousy comes over a man and he is wrought up over his wife, right? So again, maybe she's guilty, maybe she's innocent, but the main thing that puts this ritual into motion, okay, is the man's jealousy. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned, the way that this ritual is classically referred to in rabbinic texts and people talking about it using a Hebrew term today often call it the Sota Ritual, which means the ritual of the woman who has gone astray. But what we see here in the biblical text is that actually, this is a ritual for a woman who maybe has gone astray and maybe has done absolutely nothing. It's really a ritual of jealousy, right? That is the one thing that we know for sure that is going to put this ritual into play. It's the way in which the sacrificial aspect, right? The offering itself is described in the biblical text, the minchat knaot, the jealousy or jealousies offering, right? Clearly, jealousy here is being taken very seriously. So what is the deal with that? Why is jealousy so important? And how is this jealousy being viewed by the biblical text? So other biblical sources that mention jealousy, almost all of them tend to involve God. So, right, there is a stereotype, another stereotype, right, about the jealous Old Testament God, right? That's probably something that some of you have heard sort of thrown around, maybe in a derogatory context, but it is actually true that in a number of sources in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, God really is described as being jealous. This comes up a lot in the prophets and the later prophets. And it's not just that God is jealous, but interestingly enough, a frequent metaphor that is used for God's jealousy is one of adultery, in which God is referred to as a jealous husband, okay? And the Jews, Bnei Israel, right, the God's people, are referred to as the wayward wife, the wife who has strayed, okay? And God's jealousy manifests in God having a response to God's people not doing what they're supposed to do, not following God's commandments, going after other gods, right? And responding with this kind of jealous, punitive anger. That is the vast majority of instances in which jealousy comes up in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. It comes up regarding women one time in terms of the jealousy between the sisters Rachel and Leah. That's it. Otherwise, mostly God, and then occasionally men are jealous. For example, here also the story of Pinchas in Numbers, who kills two people who are having, interestingly, also a forbidden sexual relationship. Pinchas is described, they're using the same word, kinah, the same root. It's often translated there as zeal as opposed to jealousy, okay, but it's the same word in the biblical Hebrew. And what's noteworthy is, on the one hand, right, these descriptions, these depictions of jealousy clearly show that jealousy is something that is powerful, is maybe even violent, right, is going to result in some kind of negative consequences. But it actually seems to be viewed at the same time as a positive and order-keeping force. Right? God's jealousy may be scary, right? But it's what works to keep Bnei Israel, to keep the Jews in line and keep them doing the right thing, right? Pinchas's zeal, right, may have resulted in an extremely violent act, but Pinchas in that narrative is actually praised and rewarded for his zealous killing of these people. So in all of these instances, and I would argue that what's going on here in the description of this ritual for the wayward wife as well, jealousy is an emotion that is A, strongly associated with men, B, potentially a very powerful and violent force, but C, ultimately a force that's associated with the restoration of things to their proper order. And I really think that that's what's going on here in terms of why jealousy plays such a central role in the biblical Sota Ritual. It's something that actually the many texts in the Bible really take seriously and in a weird way actually even value. And we're going to see what happens to this gendered idea of jealousy in rabbinic literature. Some of what I just said is going to persist and some of it's going to be totally different. But for now, before we turn to those sources, I just want to pause to take any questions. And I will, if I can, stop my screen share for a minute. Great, okay.
All right, we do have questions. Thank you. Just before, hopefully this is the last matter on this whole technical issue we had today, but if you can, Sarah, if you can make either me or Lynn hosts of the meeting, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, you are the host.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so.
I did. Oh.
All right, so I'm just going to read this verbatim. So one person asked, does the husband do this out of his understanding of the 10th commandment? Is this his anger or the stigma of the relationship that could be known by others? Meaning, is there some way, I mean, all the initial questions were on like, what do you mean this is happening just because he's upset? But is there some charitable way of reading him or reading this ritual through a modern lens?
Yeah, so I think, there's a real concern here about what happens when the sense of how things are supposed to work in family and sexual relationships is being undermined, right? And I think in a contemporary world, right, we are much more concerned these days for real reasons with what happens, not so much on the part of women, straying from their husbands, but right, men kind of behaving in ways that are seen as sexually problematic, sexually dangerous, in some way undermining the social order, right? And I think if we think about sort of how disturbing and concerning it can be to think about, right, what happens when sort of the standards of sexual conduct that we think keep society going are actually not being respected, right? I think that's kind of the most generous way, right, to read what the concerns are here of the authors of the biblical text, right? They don't want, right, this is an era where there's no paternity tests, and, you know, whereas when women get pregnant, like you can see who the mother is because she's been pregnant, right? So there's a concern that, you know, what if, you know, women are bringing children into their family who actually don't belong to the husband, and then he has to support them, right? So there is a real fear that kind of there's going to be some kind of undermining. And definitely this is a response to that. Now, whether or not we think it's a proportional response or a fair response, I also saw a couple of questions that I'll just take this opportunity to respond to because they came to me in the chat, right? What if the wife is jealous because she suspects her husband of cheating? Okay, the biblical text doesn't seem to care about that, right? So certainly there is some degree of, right, we could say inequality here, unfairness. I think, you know, you might say this is somewhat misogynistic, right? Because there's no concern for the woman's jealousy in the case of suspecting her husband of cheating, right? But I do think it's also really important to keep in mind that it does seem like jealousy is considered in the Hebrew Bible, and we'll see in rabbinic literature too, as really being much more of a male emotion. So there's just much less of a worry that women seems like are going to feel jealous. Again, whether that's accurate or not, right? The point is that's kind of how things are being portrayed and therefore how things are being responded to. I'm happy to take another question.
Sure, why don't we do one more? So this is a little bit less about jealousy, but it's such the text is so, you know, troubling, as you know. So just a more general question. So one person was referring to Rachel Biala, who I guess argues that the Sota Ritual is actually more favorable for the accused woman than parallel ordeals in colonial America. If that's something that you know about or want to comment on.
Yeah, so there are arguments that essentially, right, the woman has to drink this sort of magic potion, and if nothing happens to her, then her name is cleared, everything is great, she can go back to her husband, and we agree that, like, the husband's jealousy was groundless, everything is fine, she's off the hook. Taking a view in which actually, like, drinking a special potion prepared for you by a priest is probably unlikely to have some kind of actual physical effect on you, right? Chances are high that it's going to seem like nothing happens to the woman. She's totally fine, right? And her name is cleared. So there are some theories this is actually really kind of a mechanism for clearing women's names, right? In an official way, maybe in a way that's going to be somewhat humiliating to the woman, but that ultimately, right, the result of this ordeal is likely to be that it seems like she's innocent and she's off the hook. So that's my guess is that's what that person is referring to. Great. Okay. I'm going to pause again a little bit to take more questions. So hold on to them and I'll pause again at the end. But I want to turn now to rabbinic literature, where we will see some continuity with what we were just talking about in the biblical text, specifically when it comes to continuing to think about jealousy as really a primarily male emotion. We're going to see that in rabbinic literature too. But for those of you who are sort of looking for, like, you know, more favorable ways in which to read these texts, the rabbinic texts are really going to push much more in a direction of seemingly minimizing the bad effects of this ritual, maybe kind of moving towards protecting women, or at least kind of being concerned about letting jealousy kind of run amok. So let's turn now to those texts. I'm gonna screen share again. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to turn now to the Mishnah. This is an earlier text in rabbinic literature. It's a sort of law code-like text that's codified at the beginning of the 3rd century Common Era. Okay, so we're now way, way, way later than the Bible. But the Mishnah is commenting here and expanding on what we just read in the biblical source. And as I said, okay, in some ways we're going to have a very similar approach to jealousy, and in some ways totally, totally different. Some of that has to do with just the genre of the Mishnah being a law code. Okay, the Mishnah is now going to talk about procedurally, how is this supposed to work? What does it mean when the Bible says, "Hamekaneh leishto," one who is jealous of his wife? Okay, so the Mishnah tells us one who is jealous of his wife, and I've now translated it in a weird way here, one who jealouses his wife, okay, because the Mishnah transforms this into a verb that refers to a special set of actions. So Rabbi Eliezer says he has to jealous her, he has to be jealous of her before 2 witnesses. So what does that mean? How does he jealous her? If he says to her before two witnesses, do not speak to so-and-so, to Joe Schmo, okay? And then she speaks with him, she's still permitted to her household. But if she enters a secluded place with him and stays there enough time to be defiled, she is forbidden to her household. Okay, so here's how things work according to the Mishnah. Here's what being jealous or jealousing somebody's wife means. It means that the man has to take his wife in front of 2 witnesses and say, don't talk anymore to Mr. Ploney, to Joe Schmo. And then the woman has to be seen entering a secluded place with Joe Schmo, right, for enough time that it would take for something untoward to happen. And there's lots of kind of entertaining discussion in rabbinic literature, which I haven't brought here, about exactly how long that is, maybe enough time to fry an egg, enough time to run around a tree. Okay, but some amount of time, enough time for something untoward to happen, then and only then can the whole rest of this ordeal be put into action. Okay, so this is a huge difference from what it seemed like in the biblical text, right? Which is the husband is upset, he feels jealous, that's it, we're done. We're going into motion and we're doing this whole ritual with this woman in front of the priest. Right here, it's much more complicated. First of all, there needs to be 2 witnesses. Second of all, there needs to be a warning about a specific person, right? And then after that warning is administered, right, there has to be a further step, which is that the wife who's been warned about a specific person has to be seen not just talking to that person, but alone with that person for some amount of time. Okay, so the bar is a lot higher. And that is what the Mishnah is trying to tell us that the Bible really means when it says a man is jealous of his wife. What it really means is all of these steps are happening. Okay, so why is the Mishnah taking such a different approach to what jealousy means from what we saw in the Bible? Okay, so one possibility that some scholars have suggested, Judith Helpman suggests this, and so does Moshe Halbertal, is that the Mishnah is trying to protect women, right? That the Mishnah is saying, wait a second, why, according to the Bible, are we just, acting on this husband's upset feelings, regardless of whether or not we have any evidence of the woman's wrongdoing. This seems bad and potentially really harmful to women and potentially, able to be sort of abused. And we're going to make this actually much harder, right? We don't just want any old husband to be able to, take his wife to the priest and kind of humiliate her publicly whenever he wants, right? There actually has to be a much more difficult series of steps. Okay, so that is one, I think, real possibility for what's going on in the Mishnah. Another possibility, which is maybe less kind of morally appealing for what's going on in the Mishnah, is the Mishnah has a law code, and everything that the rabbis talk about in the Mishnah kind of gets legalized and proceduralized and just sort of subsumed into the way the rabbis think that legal procedures are supposed to happen. So, for example, in the Mishnah, the rabbis are really, really into the idea that everything needs to happen in front of witnesses. That's just kind of fundamental to how the rabbis think about court cases and legal proceedings, right? So it's possible that they say it has to happen before two witnesses, not out of a feminist, concern for protecting, women from being abused by the system, but just because that's what they think. Witnesses are important. Of course, you have to have two witnesses here, just like you have to have them in, murder cases and everywhere else, right? So it's also possible that part of what's going on here is really just, this is kind of how the rabbinic mind works, right? And so we're winding up with something that's much more proceduralized for that reason. And that's also something that some scholars have suggested. But what I want to suggest is that yet a third explanation for why the Mishnah is presenting jealousy in this really limiting and procedural way. Okay, and that is that there's actually a shift in the Mediterranean in the Second Temple period, so the period sort of at the end of the Hebrew Bible coming together, right before the Mishnah is created, a shift in terms of how jealousy is thought about. And basically, what happens during the Second Temple period is that almost everybody, both Greco-Roman thinkers and early Jewish thinkers, shift from thinking of jealousy as dangerous but fundamentally good and order preserving to thinking of it as actually dangerous and fundamentally bad, and something that really ought to be avoided. So, for example, here is a text from the book of Ben Sirach. This is a Second Temple text that doesn't wind up becoming part of the Hebrew Bible, but is considered to be part of the Apocrypha. It is written by an early Jewish group during this time. It resembles other biblical texts, including works that are thought of sort of as part of wisdom literature, and it actually does appear in some Christian Bibles, but it comes from an early Jewish source around 2nd century BC. And it actually has an explicit injunction against jealousy. Do not be jealous for the wife of your bosom. Don't be jealous about your wife, lest you teach her to do evil against you. Don't be jealous. It's bad. It is going to result in bad things for you. And we see a similar trend in Stoic texts, okay, in the Greco-Roman world that really characterize emotions. Certain emotions as good and certain emotions as bad. Jealousy is definitely bad. In early thinkers, Jewish thinkers like the historian Josephus, or Philo, right, who's an early biblical interpreter, the very beginning of the Common Era, when they're talking about jealousy, they're making it very clear that they think that jealousy is bad. It is going to result in bad consequences, and it should be avoided. And we see this as well, even if this isn't explicit in the Mishnah, which, as I mentioned, right, is really much more of a law code. There are other texts that are contemporaneous with the Mishnah, also being written by rabbis, right, also in the first few centuries of the Common Era, that clearly talk about jealousy, including jealousy in the context of this ordeal of the adulterous woman, as an emotion, and as an emotion that's dangerous. Okay, so just to offer an example, so I told you we would come back to the kind of funny language in the biblical text that talks about the offering of jealousies, plural, right? Minchat kenaot, 2 jealousies. So this text number 4, which is a work of early rabbinic biblical interpretation, the Sifrei, picks up on sort of the weirdness of this language, that the Bible doesn't say an offering of jealousy, but an offering of jealousies. And it says 2 jealousies, shtei knaot. Just as she causes the husband jealousy, so too she causes the lover jealousy. Or alternately, just as she causes jealousy on earth, so too she causes jealousy in heaven. Okay, so the text here, this midrash on the biblical verse is saying, actually, you know, the reason it says 2 jealousies is because there really are multiple figures here who are feeling jealous. Interestingly, this is the first time we're hearing about the woman's lover possibly having some feelings involved here, right? He is perhaps jealous too in this situation, right? Or again, we're coming back to this idea of God's jealousy is a factor here, right? So just as there's some jealousy happening on earth, so too is that jealousy being mirrored in heaven. So this is really a view of jealousy that seems to think of it, first of all, it's still male, okay? Nobody is talking about the woman here potentially feeling jealous, okay? That the 2 jealousies are either the husband and the lover, or you know, jealousy on earth, which again presumably is the husband, and jealousy in heaven, right? God's jealousy traditionally gendered as male. Okay, so it's still male. And it's also contagious, right? Jealousy is bad because it causes more jealousy. So this is an idea that people sometimes talk about today, actually, right? This idea of memetic desire, right? That desire comes when you see somebody else desiring something, right? So it's not necessarily that I personally, you know, desire a cool pair of sneakers, but when I see that other people desire those sneakers, that's actually where my own desire comes from. Very kind of similar idea here in terms of jealousy, that jealousy on the part of one actor or feeler, right, is going to actually provoke more jealousy in other people. Okay, so let's go back to the Mishnah for a second. So how does this context help us understand the Mishnah and the Mishnah's really regulated and procedural vision of what jealousy looks like? An official warning before 2 witnesses, right? Not really very kind of emotive. So if we're thinking about a world in which jealousy is seen as bad and is seen as contagious, right? Something that is going to quickly kind of spiral out of control and spread to other people. So what may be going on in the Mishnah is, as much as maybe there's a desire to protect the woman through this more kind of regimented and procedural sort of standard for jealousy, right? There's also a desire to limit and legislate the possibly uncontained destructive power of male jealousy, right? By saying, okay, actually what jealousy means is it's actually going to conform to this very specific procedure that we can see, that we can regulate, that we can control. And we're gonna see that this trend continues even further in the Talmud, this concern for what can happen with jealousy, and a sense of actually what needs to happen in this ritual context is to limit it. But before we go there, I'm just going to pause again for questions before we turn to our last couple of sources.
We have a ton of questions.
Great.
Okay, so a lot of people have asked if there's any evidence that the Sota Ritual was actually carried out. You know, were women being thrown out of their houses and, you know, are subjected to this? And I couldn't remember any, but the question's for you, and you certainly know more exhaustively than I do. And I think the larger question there is this a real kind of a real social issue that we need to grapple with, or are we really more looking at these texts for, you know, to mine their attitudes and assumptions about jealousy and gender?
Yeah, excellent question. So this is often a question that gets asked about rabbinic texts, right? Are they talking about something that really happened, or are they actually just kind of exploring an idea that, you know, is in the Torah because they need to sort of interpret it and understand it, or because it's food for thought? It so happens that in terms of this ordeal, the Sota ordeal, the Mishnah says explicitly at the end of Mishnah Sota that by the time of the Mishnah, this isn't happening anymore. Okay, now the reason for that is a little weird, which is that the Mishnah says basically that there's too much adultery, and so like it's kind of too much for the system to be able to handle, so they've kind of given up on it. But whether or not that's true, the rabbis of the Mishnah are actually acknowledging that this is not part of their social reality. So whether or not this may have happened in certain early Jewish sects in the pre-rabbinic period, certainly by the time of the rabbinic period, it is not happening. I would say this is definitely an example where they're using these texts, I think, to think through some ideas about emotion and gender and sexual relationships, right? But it's not actually about responding to real on the ground social concerns. And I think that's actually very interesting for us in terms of what we might take from these texts, right? Knowing that they're not actually telling us to go out and do this, right? And are nonetheless taking these ideas really seriously. And I'm actually going to return to that hopefully at the end. So I really appreciate the question.
Great, thank you. One person asked, do you think that these rituals and rules are there to try to save marriages or justify divorces? If you think either, and I wonder if the answer is different for the biblical versus rabbinic sources.
Yeah. That is a great question. Yeah, there's a whole context here of sort of debates that are also happening in late antiquity about divorce and about what are the acceptable grounds for divorce. So there's some debate in rabbinic sources about whether basically in order for divorce to happen, there needs to be some kind of proof of wrongdoing, right? This is like in New York State, you know, until sometime weirdly recently, you couldn't have a no-fault divorce. There had to be some kind of proof of adultery in the relationship, right? And that is basically also a position that appears in rabbinic literature. But it is the minority position. It's not the position that's accepted. And ultimately, rabbinic literature is going to come down on the side of that actually divorce can happen for a whole variety of reasons, and that is fine, and that we don't sort of need to be overly worried about rampant divorce, that it's sort of better for people to be able to end relationships that aren't working for them, even if there's not like blatant evidence of some kind of wrongdoing or sexual wrongdoing. So, you know, thinking about this ritual in that context, you know, this wouldn't need to happen in order for, and again, it's a unfortunately unequal gendered thing in rabbinic literature, right? But according to rabbinic texts, men are the ones who can initiate a divorce. Again, this may be actually sort of out of a desire to protect women and not kind of leave them, you know, out of the context of marriage, which was sort of viewed as a better kind of more protective way for women to live. But in any case, in rabbinic literature, men can initiate divorce for lots of other reasons besides something like this. So I would say that because of that, and because of, I think, what we're seeing in the Mishnah in terms of a much more restrictive kind of policy about when this particular ordeal can be set into motion, it seems like it's, if I were going to pick one, it's more the protecting marriages kind of thing than it is the aiding divorce kind of thing. But I do think that context is really useful, actually, in terms of you know, what is going on in terms of broader discussions about marriage and impropriety and sort of agency about what to do when marriages aren't working.
Great, thank you. Can we do one more?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have more than one, but so a number of people have raised the question of, you know, shouldn't they really be focusing on actions or on then instead of emotions? Meaning, right, we can't. One can be controlled, and one, for the most part, can't. And a few people have raised the 10th commandment as being, several people as being connected to jealousy. You know, if I don't know if envy and coveting and jealousy are all the same thing, or if they have different shades of meaning. But it seems at least to accept that these are natural human feelings. Someone also asked, you know, maybe we even, something that you said earlier kind of seemed to imply that we need jealousy to kind of keep relationships in line. I think that was your charitable reading of Sota. But yeah, it should we or the rabbis going to be sort of more accepting of the existence of these kinds of feelings and really just focusing our judgment and evaluations on actions?
Great. Good. This is a really helpful question. I think will also be a good transition into the next sources. So I'll just, first of all, just in terms of in the 10 commandments, so just sort of like on a technical level, the prohibition, as Rabbi Angela was alluding to, the prohibition against coveting in the 10 commandments is a little bit different, just in terms of the language that is used from language of jealousy. So don't covet is lo tachmod. The root is chet mem dalet. It's a different word from the word here for jealousy, which is kina, root kuf nun aleph. There are commentators that talk about not coveting as kind of being related to actions that are going to wind up, you know, in theft or in some way actually trying to take things that aren't yours. Right. What we're seeing with jealousy here, this is another important difference, I think. Coveting in the context of the Ten Commandments, or we might also think of this as envy, right? It seems to be much more about things that don't belong to you and that you don't have a right to, right? So in the Ten Commandments, right, men are prohibited from coveting their neighbors' wives, okay, because their neighbors' wives are people who, right, actually they should not be involved with. Whereas here, what we're seeing is jealousy as actually applying to, right, people who are already married, right? So it's not so much about a dangerous urge for something that you really have no right to be involved with, but it's about much more of a feeling of possessiveness for a person in this case who, you know, in the system of, you know, marital law, you're supposed to have some kind of right of exclusivity in regard to. Okay, so I think that is an important distinction. But, you know, in terms of the action piece, so I think one could argue that this is actually exactly what the Mishnah is doing, right? The Mishnah is transforming the biblical text, which does just seem to say like, okay, it's a feeling, and anytime anybody has a feeling that's good or bad, or we respond to it in some way, to, oh, well, we don't really just mean a feeling, we actually mean a set of actions, right? And we can respond to those actions or not, right? At least in the Mishnah, whether or not somebody has a feeling in private, if they never say anything about it to their wife, like presumably that's actually totally fine. It is true that the other texts that we saw and that I talked about do seem to view jealousy as an emotion, and right, for example, like the Ben Sirach text that says don't be jealous for the wife of your bosom, it's not totally clear if it's talking there about, you know, something that's more of an emotion or something that's more of an action. But yeah, let me turn now to what happens with this idea in the Babylonian Talmud, because I think that's a really interesting instance of, on the one hand, it seems like the Talmud, as we'll see in a second, is actually going to totally prohibit jealousy, but there it really seems to be prohibiting the action as described in the Mishnah, meaning people should not be warning their wives in this special procedural way and thereby putting this whole ordeal into motion. I don't think the Babylonian Talmud is actually saying never feel jealous. I think that what it's going to be saying is don't act this way. But I want to return to this theme of sort of external action versus internal emotion at the end. Okay, so let me go back to screen share here. Okay. Great. So we're skipping source 5 for time and turning now to source 6 from the Babylonian Talmud, which another rabbinic text later than the Mishnah, and is responding to and in some ways sort of interpreting the Mishnah just like the Mishnah is responding to and interpreting the text of the Torah. So the Talmud here is starting off with a quote from the Mishnah that we just saw, okay, about one who jealouses his wife, and is going to then come up with an even more restrictive interpretation of the Mishnah. The Talmud says that when the Mishnah says one who is jealous of his wife does it this way and doesn't do it that way, that actually the Mishnah is only really saying that this is true after the fact. Meaning, if a husband has sort of done all of these things, then fine, that's all happened. And I guess we then have to go ahead and set this whole ordeal into motion. But ideally, ab initio, this should not happen. The Mishnah is not telling husbands to do this whole procedure of warning their wives if they're concerned. No, in fact, the Talmud claims that according to the Mishnah, it's forbidden to jealous, right? Or to be jealous. But I think here the Talmud is really talking about to go through this whole procedural thing, right? The Talmud is claiming that the Mishnah thinks this whole thing is forbidden. If it happens after the fact, fine, we then have to sort of take that as sort of ritually significant or legally binding, and then, go through this whole ritual, but one should not do it. Okay, and why not? So in the discussion in the Talmud here, what we're going to see is a portrayal of jealousy that is quite similar to the portrayal that we saw in text number 4, the Sifrei text, that viewed jealousy as male and as contagious. So here, again, we're interpreting the Mishnah, and the rabbis in the Talmud are saying, well, wait a second, if the Mishnah is talking about this whole warning procedure, and that's really what we're dealing with, what is the language of kinui, of jealousy? Why is it using this language of jealousy to describe a warning process? And sorry that I left it here in the transliteration, but you can substitute the word jealousy basically for all of these cases of kinui and kina if you like. Okay, so the rabbi is asking, why is the Mishnah using this language of jealousy to describe the Mishnah's warning process? Because actually, this warning process is going to produce more jealousy. It's going to produce kina between her and others, right? And this Rabbi Reish Lakish thinks that actually kinui, the act of warning, of jealousing, can be performed by the husband alone with no witnesses. No one else knows that he's done this. And therefore, everyone else is going to say, what happened that she's ignoring us now? We don't know why. We didn't know that her husband warned us to stop spending time with us. Like, what's going on? And they're going to come to have jealousy regarding her. This other rabbi, Rav Yemar Bar Shlami, in the name of Abaye, says, no, the reason that the Mishnah uses this language of jealousy to describe this formal warning is that it produces kina, produces jealousy between him and her, between the husband and the wife. He's doing it in front of 2 witnesses. Everyone's going to know that he's done it. And he himself, the husband himself, is actually going to come to have more jealousy regarding his wife as a result of having done the Mishnah's jealousing warning process, okay? And therefore, the Talmud tells us it is forbidden to perform kinui. It is forbidden to perform this formal jealousing warning act as described in the Mishnah. Right, so again, picking up on this theme of jealousy as bad, as contagious, as something that's going to be produced in men specifically, right? And as a result, the Talmud is saying that we want to avoid things that are going to make that happen. Okay, a little different than saying it's forbidden to be jealous, right? But it's forbidden to perform the official jealousy procedure of warning as laid out in the Mishnah, because it's going to cause feelings of jealousy, and that's what we don't want. And what's really interesting about the sort of now full expression that we've just seen in the Talmud of this jealousy is male, dangerous, and should be prevented trend, is that there's a rabbinic scholar named Charlotte von Robert who has argued that there's a paradigm in the Talmud in which men generally are seen as having dangerous and out of control emotions, and that women in the Talmud generally are often portrayed as sort of calming down, voices of reason, making sure that men's emotions don't come out of control, right? So all of the stuff that we're seeing about jealousy and about jealousy being dangerous is actually just one side of this really interesting gendered paradigm. And I'll just very briefly offer one example of another story where something like that happens. So this is probably one of the most famous stories in the Talmud. If you don't know it, I haven't included the famous part here, but you can look up the citation and you can see the famous part yourself. I'll paraphrase the famous part for you, which is there is a debate between the rabbis about whether a particular oven is pure and impure or impure. One of the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, is like, I am right, and I am going to make supernatural things happen to prove it. If I'm right, then the walls of the study house are gonna cave in. If I'm right, then this tree is gonna uproot itself. All of these things happen. God seems to be on Rabbi Eliezer's side about this argument. And nonetheless, the rabbis say, too bad, majority rules, we disagree with you, and therefore the law is not going to follow you. Doesn't matter that, you were able to make all of these supernatural things happen in support of your argument. And a heavenly voice comes down, and God laughs and says, my children have defeated me. Okay, this is the famous part of the story. We're now picking up after that, right after this happens. Okay, so all of Rabbi Eliezer's colleagues have voted against him, even though he seemed to sort of have God on his side in some way. They voted against him for procedural reasons. Okay, and what happens? So they outvoted Rabbi Eliezer, and they take all of the things that Rabbi Eliezer had ruled were pure, and they burn them, okay, and they ban them. And Rabbi Eliezer is extremely upset. His eyes stream with tears. He took off his shoes. He sits on the ground. And as a result of Rabbi Eliezer being upset, horrible environmental devastation happens. The world was smitten in 1/3 of the wheat, 1/3 of the olives, and 1/3 of the barley. All of these crops get destroyed. There's a teaching that actually everywhere Rabbi Eliezer casts his eyes just gets burned. Okay, his upset is so powerful that it is actually causing physical destruction to the world around him and to another person. So Rabban Gamliel, who holds an official position as sort of a political head of the rabbinic movement, so he's sort of representing here all the rest of the rabbis who have voted against Rabbi Eliezer. He's on a ship, and a wave of the sea starts to drown him. So Rabban Gamliel says, aha, I think that this is because Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Hyrcanus, is upset. So he gets up and he says, Master of the universe, I acted not for my honor, nor for the honor of my father's house, right, this special political position that he's in, but I acted for your honor in order that disagreements do not multiply in Israel, and the sea rests from its anger. Okay, so again, Rabbi Eliezer's sort of potentially destructive emotions are potentially going to cause the death of his colleague at sea. Okay, and here we see where a woman intervenes or tries to intervene to calm things down. So Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, also happens to be the sister of Rabban Gamliel. And after this happens, after her brother has nearly died at sea, she never allows her husband, Eliezer, to pray with supplicatory prayers. The language here is to fall on his face, right? But to pray sort of out of an upset, emotional way. But one day, it's the new month, when poor people tend to come around, a poor person comes to the door and she says, oh, I'm going to give him some bread. She's distracted. She comes back and she finds that while she's been away, distracted, tending to this poor person, her husband has fallen on his face. And she says, stand up, you have killed my brother. And indeed, the shofar blast goes out, indicating that because of the power of Rabbi Eliezer's upset prayer, Rabban Gamliel has died. Okay, so this is, right, a really, I think, striking example of a theme that you just have to take my word for it, we see throughout the Talmud, which is, on the one hand, the incredibly potentially destructive force of male emotions, right, which can cause harm to the environment, can kill other people, right, not because men are going out and like stabbing other people, but right, just somehow the force of the emotion itself kind of causes these things to happen. And at the same time, that the women in these stories are the ones who are trying to moderate and regulate and say, wait a second, your emotions actually have really strong power, and you need to be careful that you are not letting them get out of hand. So I think that looking at this kind of larger context for this emotional paradigm throughout the Talmud is really helpful, just to see ways in which these associations between gender and emotion are historically contingent, right? That in rabbinic literature, there's this idea that men have over the top emotions and women are the ones to be calm and rational, right? This is really different than, let's say, Victorian ideas of women as hysterical, right? So I think it's just useful to see how these different paradigms are so socially constructed and right, don't necessarily mean anything essential about gender, and yet at the same time have so much power. And even though these are constructed ideas, I think there is something potentially really powerful and useful for today's day and age in reclaiming texts that acknowledge the dangers of unchecked male emotional intensity and see it as potentially harmful to other people, right? Whether that is other men or women or the environment, right? And if we think about contemporary contexts, right, this could be arenas of all male spaces where we know that emotions can get channeled into really dangerous outcomes, right? Whether that's military or fraternity hazing, or professional sports, even football, right? Or the flip side, issues of domestic violence, right? Which is probably kind of the closest analog that we have to, right, dangerous jealousy towards a female sexual partner, that this concern about jealousy in the Sota ordeal seems to be trying to address. And I think rabbinic literature, right, for all that I just said, that there's this turn towards action, rabbinic literature does still remind us that it's important to pay attention as much to emotions as it is to behavior, right? And to figure out how to encourage people to regulate their emotions and to channel them in ways that aren't destructive to people, right? I'm not saying that the models in rabbinic texts here are ones that we should adopt wholesale. And right, as we talked about, the Mishnah itself acknowledges that these rituals aren't even happening in real life. But I do think that as disturbing as some of these texts and ideas may be, they can also still potentially be really valuable to us as food for thought to help us in how we think about questions of emotion and gender and gendered violence today. Okay, I will pause here. I know we only have a few minutes. I would love to take at least one more question, and I also, I'm gonna just throw my email into the chat. I would love to hear from people. Happy to answer any and all questions online, and I can stay on for a couple more minutes.
Thank you so much. That was such a powerful way that you, yeah, I think that you can't send to the chat, but we can share your we can share your email with everyone. It's S.A. Wolfe, right? That was such a powerful and and weighty way of ending. So right. I mean, even there's so much just in the news right now that really connects to what you just said. So I hesitate to take us anywhere else, but I did want to raise just something that a number of people asked at the beginning, and maybe it connects in some way. People were citing examples of women's jealousy and saying, what about that? The one that most people mentioned, the one that was mentioned most often was Sarai being jealous of Hagar when she has a child and Sarai doesn't. So maybe I'll shift the question a little bit. So, yes, we certainly have those examples, and maybe ask you, do you think that there's, drawing on those and other examples, do you think that there's something different in the sources about kind of the nature of male jealousy and female jealousy? And of course, this is, assuming a binary world, which is also a problem, but putting that out there.
Yes, for sure. And I didn't say this, but, just sort of state the obvious, right? Rabbinic literature is assuming a world of gender binaries, also a world of purely heterosexual sexual relationships, right? This is, again, right, not to say that is what was really the case at the time, but just that's what the text is assuming. So that's what we're talking about here. I think one, right, so yeah, as I tried to argue, I think rabbinic texts are much more worried about male jealousy than they are about female jealousy. They might talk a little bit about female jealousy, but they don't see it as the same kind of potentially destructive force. Now, I think some of that has to do with the inequality in gender relationships that has kind of also been a theme throughout all of these sources, right? In a world in which men hold more power, it also makes sense that there's also going to be more concern about, right, what can happen as a result of their emotions, right? I think those things are really closely tied together. So again, I don't think it's, I'm not trying to claim that the rabbis don't think that women can be jealous or, that they're not capable of having those feelings, but they do seem to be much more preoccupied with the results of male jealousy. I mean, I'll say one other thing, which is, as I mentioned, we didn't get to see any of these sources, but there's so many biblical sources about God being jealous, and God being jealous in this sort of metaphor of the sort of spurned husband, and the really dangerous results of that. And, the rabbis are living at a time in which they basically believe that has happened and has been terrible, meaning God's jealousy and anger at various wrongdoings resulted in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and, the total, the largely, reevaluation of, what it meant to be a Jew in that time, right? So it also makes sense that they see this actually as sort of a problem and as destructive, right, in a way that right, isn't necessarily true in kind of, let's say, politically calmer eras.
Thank you so much. I think you justified our title for the series, "The Power of Emotion," in your session today, and it's such an interesting lens to. I was going to say new. It's actually ancient, but the way you've put it all together, I think, really sheds new light for us on thinking about jealousy and specifically, and its destructive power, or different ways that it can be better and worse ways that it can be channeled, and how that's been a concern for thousands of years. So thank you so much. Thanks for your quick change earlier on, coming up to teach on the 9th floor, and thanks to everyone for your patience with that. Of course, we want to once again thank our sponsors, our anonymous Navi level sponsor, and Dr. Amy Worman for sponsoring in memory of your beloved mother, Rabbi Marilyn Worman. Thanks to everyone for coming. We look forward to seeing you next week. Dr. Alan Cooper is going to teach on the burning heart from the book of Jeremiah to the Metropolitan Opera. So not to be missed. Thank you once again, Professor Wolfe, for teaching us today. Thanks everyone for joining us. See you again soon.
Thanks everyone.